I'm Olivia Williams, 47, and I went from a quiet girl in Norfolk to a rear admiral in the United States Navy. For years, I showed up for my family, absorbed the silence, and kept proving myself without ever being truly seen. But when my own mother smiled while I was humiliated at the Navy ball, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed by someone you gave your loyalty, patience, and love to? If you have, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, dignity, and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. My mother used to say that love was something you demonstrated through investment. She meant tuition payments and networking calls and favors she collected over years and redeemed on our behalf. She was not a cold woman. She was a woman who believed that building a future for someone was the highest expression of caring about them. She built George's future first, because he was older and because what she imagined for him matched what she understood. She started building mine second, and when I dismantled it and built something she couldn't read, she treated that as a failure of gratitude rather than a declaration of self. I was born on March 15th, 1979, in Norfolk, Virginia. The city is a Navy town whether you want it to be or not. The harbor is visible from most of the routes you take to get anywhere. And the base is a fact of daily geography, the way a courthouse or a hospital is a fact in other cities. My father, Thomas Williams, worked as a logistics coordinator at a shipping company near the waterfront. My mother, Josephine, managed accounts receivable for a mid-size insurance firm downtown. They separated in 1985 when I was 6, without much outward drama. My father moved to a smaller apartment near the port. My mother moved us to a house in a slightly better school district and reorganized her priorities around a new architecture, the future she was building for her children on her own terms. George was 9 when they separated and already showing the kind of verbal sharpness that Josephine understood as promise. She enrolled him in debate, reinforced his homework routines, attended every school event with the alertness of someone monitoring a significant investment. I was 3 years younger and watching all of it. Not resentfully, just watching. The way you watch the weather when you're young enough to not understand what it means, but old enough to feel it arriving before it does. I was a quiet child. I noticed things. I noticed that the men and women walking near the naval base carried themselves differently than other adults. Not stiffly, but with a particular kind of organization to how they moved through space. I noticed the insignia on their collars and wondered about the system behind it. On the drive to school, I'd watch an officer come out of a building and ask my mother what the gold stripe meant. She'd say she didn't know and redirect to George's upcoming tournament or the grade he'd pulled in his history class. Her attention was not capricious. It was structured. It flowed toward the legible and redirected away from the things she couldn't explain at her dinner parties. She never said she was disappointed in me. She didn't have to. She had a way of talking about George that said it for her. In 1990, she married Harold Voss. Harold was a quiet, steady accountant with a deliberate manner and no particular interest in being the loudest person in a room. He came with a son, Daniel, 7 years old and 4 years younger than me, who joined us on weekends and summers from a prior relationship. Daniel was small and uncertain and didn't know yet where the cups were kept or which bathroom was for guests. I showed him. Nobody told me to. I wasn't performing generosity for anyone's benefit. I was just wired that way. If someone nearby was disoriented, I wanted to orient them. We got along without effort from the first week, and that quality of effortlessness would hold for the next 34 years without ever requiring much maintenance from either of us. Harold was kind. He asked me about school with genuine curiosity. He didn't understand my interest in military structure and the organization of command, but he asked follow-up questions, which was more than most adults in my life were willing to do. Josephine was fond of Harold in the practical way she was fond of anything that worked reliably and required minimal emergency management. The marriage functioned, the household expanded. Josephine's map of success now had another column. Harold's steady income, George's academic trajectory, and in a newer entry, whatever she was constructing for Camille. A younger child from Harold's prior relationship who joined us occasionally and whom Josephine absorbed into her framework of achievable ambition within a few years. I was not difficult. I want to be precise about this because it matters to the shape of the story. I earned good grades. I read constantly. I did not create scenes or require intervention. I was simply interested in something she could not use, which is a different category of problem than being a troubled child, but still a problem inside Josephine's system of management and legibility. By the time I was 15, the interest had become a direction. I had been reading naval history with the focus other kids brought to sports statistics. I had begun to understand rank structure and chain of command, had started to see intelligence work as a genuine professional field, one requiring sustained rigor and judgment, and exactly the kind of concentrated patience I was discovering I had in abundance. My school had a librarian who pulled books she thought I would find useful. She was the first adult outside Harold who seemed to track what I was actually thinking about rather than what she preferred me to think about. In 1997, I was 18, and I had done something my mother didn't know I was doing. I had pursued a Naval Academy appointment through my congressional representative's office. It required a nomination, a physical examination, essays, records, and letters of reference. I completed the entire process on my own time, alongside everything else I was managing, without telling anyone in my family until the application deadline made disclosure necessary. Josephine had spent 2 years building a law school path for me. She had called in professional favors, written letters to contacts, researched programs with the meticulousness she brought to everything she cared about. She believed she had engineered an outcome. She had done the work. She had, in the logic of her world, fully earned the credit for what she believed was coming. I sat down at the kitchen table and told her the week before the law school application deadline. I built that application myself, Olivia. I called in every favor I had. And you want to go play sailor? She wasn't wrong to be upset. She had worked for it. I just hadn't asked her to. She didn't shout. She went quiet in a way I had learned, over 18 years, to recognize as worse than shouting, the particular silence of someone absorbing a result they consider a rejection of themselves, rather than simply a decision made by another person with her own answer. She left the kitchen without asking me why I wanted this or what I hoped for. The absence of those questions told me something I would spend years more fully understanding. I enrolled at the Naval Academy in Annapolis in the fall of 1997. Josephine and I spoke during those years, with a surface correctness neither of us examined too closely. She did not rescind her support in any material sense. She also offered no new support, asked nothing about the curriculum or the training or the life I was building inside those gates. She maintained a functional neutrality that I accepted as the best available arrangement between us. I was commissioned as an ensign, pay grade 01, in the United States Navy on a morning in May of 2001. The ceremony was on the parade ground at Annapolis. It was a clear morning. The whole class stood in dress whites. They read our names aloud, and we crossed the stage, and the bars went on, and there was that full, layered sound of a ceremony that means something to everyone standing inside it. I scanned the crowd before they called my name. It was automatic. I wasn't certain I was doing it until I was already doing it. George was there for 40 minutes and left for a prior commitment I'd been told about in advance. Harold had wanted to come and couldn't, and sent a note that was genuinely apologetic. Daniel, 18 that spring, had sent a handwritten letter that arrived 3 days before the ceremony. It said he was proud of me and that he didn't entirely know what an ensign was, but that it sounded important, and he was sure I had earned it. Josephine sent a card. It read, "Good luck." I kept Daniel's letter in the pocket of my dress uniform for the ceremony, not as a substitute for what was missing, as what was true. The moment they pinned those bars on me, I looked for her face in the crowd. It wasn't there. I've been looking for it in rooms ever since, without knowing, until much later, that it wouldn't have been what I needed, even if I'd found it. I stood outside the academy gates afterward in the afternoon light, the ensign bars catching the sun, the folded letter in my pocket. The bleachers behind me were emptying. I stood there for a minute and took in what I had done, and then I oriented myself toward what came next. It was the only direction I knew how to move. It always had been. I am going to compress 23 years into the space it deserves, which is not very much space. The pattern inside those years is simple, and simple things do not require long explanations. They require honest ones. The pattern was this. I advanced through the naval rank structure in ways that would have been remarkable to anyone paying attention. My family was not paying attention. When they noticed at all, they framed what they saw as less than it was, or redirected around it toward things that fit their existing frame. When the advancement became too significant to dismiss cleanly, my mother found a way to absorb it into her own narrative without any adjustment to the underlying view she held of me. That is the whole of it. Everything else is detail filling in the outline. I was promoted to Lieutenant Junior Grade 02 in 2003 at 24. I was promoted to Lieutenant 03 in 2005 at 26 and received my first classified posting. Neither promotion was acknowledged at family gatherings. I don't mean this as an accusation. I mean it as observation. The topic simply didn't arise. Other things arose. George's legal career was producing milestones that organized dinner conversation with ease. George was doing things Josephine had words for, and her vocabulary expanded naturally around what she could describe to the room. In 2007, George passed the bar. He was 31. Josephine threw a party, catered, well-attended, and warm in the way Josephine was always genuinely warm when something mapped onto her sense of what a life should produce. I attended. I sat in a room full of people celebrating the career I had been supposed to have, and I was not bitter about George's success. He had worked hard and was genuinely skilled at the work. I was something more specific than bitter. I was watching how praise functioned inside my family and understanding, with greater clarity than before, that I was outside the frame it required to operate. At that party, I mentioned to my mother that I had been cited for distinguished service at my intelligence posting. I couldn't characterize the work further. The commendation was real, had come from my commanding officer following a consequential operation. I was still not at liberty to describe years later. My mother said, "Well, that's nice," and redirected the conversation to Camille's architecture program. Compress further to a Thanksgiving phone call 2 years after that. I am at a classified assignment overseas, one I have never named to anyone in my family and will not name in this telling. I call home. My mother tells me Camille has been promoted at her architecture firm and is buying her first property. I mention I have been commended for service on a consequential operation. She says, "Well, that's nice," and keeps moving. No follow-up question. The call moves on to other topics. There is a particular loneliness in doing work that matters and having no one in your family understand that it does. I got used to it over the years. I want to be clear. Getting used to something is not the same as it being fine. What I had, instead of acknowledgement, was the work itself. I was good at it. That is not arrogance. It is a fact I arrived at through evidence, through the quality of assessments I produced, and the trust my commanding officers extended, and the assignments I was given that were not given to people who weren't trusted with them. I was building something real inside a structure that valued precision and accountability and results, and I understood, by my late 20s, that the structure would not disappoint me the way my family would, because the structure had clear rules for what constituted success and applied them without regard for what it had expected me to be. That is a cold comfort, and I am not pretending otherwise. You cannot replace the warmth of family acknowledgement with institutional recognition and call it equivalent. But you can do excellent work and let the work be what it is, and I did. For 23 years, I did. I was promoted to Lieutenant Commander 04 in 2010 at 31. I came home on leave and told my mother. She was at the kitchen counter going through the mail. She did not look up. She said, "Does that mean more money?" George was in the room and made a mild comment about my finally catching up to the rest of the family. Harold asked what a lieutenant commander did day to day, and I gave him the sanitized, declassified version, and he nodded with the specific interest of a man who was always genuinely trying to understand a world he hadn't been introduced to. Nobody in that room understood that reaching 04 in 9 years of naval intelligence service was not catching up to anything. I didn't explain it. Explaining would have required a scene, and I had been taught that scenes were unbecoming. She said, "Well, I suppose it's a step. George just made partner, you know." I did know. She had told me 4 times. Harold Voss died of a heart attack in November of 2013. He was 65. I flew back at personal expense, arranged the flowers, coordinated with the funeral home, stayed 3 extra days to handle the administrative aftermath, while George and Camille managed Josephine's immediate emotional needs. At the reception, in a moment of genuine grief that had lowered all her usual defenses, Josephine took my hand and said, "You're always the one who shows up." It was the kindest thing she had said to me in years. 2 days later, the window had closed and she was telling everyone about George's upcoming trial. I filed the kindness somewhere I did not visit often. In 2014, at 35, I was promoted to Commander, 05. Josephine sent a card. In 2018, at 39, I was promoted to Captain, 06. This is the highest commissioned officer grade, below flag rank, equivalent to a full colonel in the Army. Josephine attended the ceremony. As another guest congratulated her, she said, "Finally! She's always done things in her own time." I heard it from across the room. I did not correct her. I had been refusing to correct her for 20 years. In 2022, at 43, I was selected for flag rank. Rear Admiral, lower half, 07. Assigned as Deputy Director of Naval Operations Intelligence at the Pentagon. I called my mother from my office after receiving the selection notification. She said, "Well, I suppose that's something." Then she asked about Daniel's new apartment. 23 years of a career that would have been remarkable to anyone paying attention, compressed to 4 words and a redirect. The pattern wasn't escalating, it was solidifying. That is the warning sign I should have named sooner. Not the moments when things grew worse, but the moments when the arrangement simply became permanent, calcified into something that no longer required active maintenance because it had become the structure itself. I sat in my Pentagon office after that call and looked at the selection letter on my desk. I had earned Rear Admiral. I had done it without her watching, without her acknowledgement, without anything from her, except the accumulated absence of it. The career existed independent of whether she had ever looked at it directly. That independence was not something I had planned. It had simply been the condition under which the career had grown, the way a tree grows toward available light rather than toward the light it was promised. I put the phone in my desk drawer and went back to work. It was the only direction I knew how to move. In September of 2024, Rear Admiral Mark Reed came to my office personally. Reed, 08, Rear Admiral Upper Half and Master of Ceremonies for the annual Navy Ball in Norfolk, stood in my doorway and told me I'd been selected to receive the Distinguished Service Medal. He had placed me on the program. Reed and I had worked in proximity for years, across assignments and briefings, and the particular trust that accumulates between people doing classified work at the same level. There was no performance in how he delivered the news. He said, "You've earned this, Olivia. Everyone in this building knows what you've carried." He was referring to 23 years of intelligence work at the highest classification levels, work that was consequential by necessity and invisible by design, the kind that does not produce public commendations or news coverage, but produces results that people in certain rooms understand without needing them explained. I accepted in my standard register, measured, direct, no performance. On the drive home that evening, I made a decision I didn't announce aloud even to myself. I called Josephine and invited her to the Navy Ball. She said she would come. She sounded more curious than proud. I told myself it didn't matter which. I called Daniel separately. He accepted with the particular uncomplicated warmth he always brought to things involving me. No hedging, no condition, just a yes and a comment about not owning a suit formal enough, which he said he would resolve before October. He asked me what the medal was for, and I gave him the answer I was permitted to give: distinguished service over a long career. He said that sounded right and that he'd be there. He did not make it more complicated than that, and I loved him for it. The days between the invitation and the ball were ordinary. I worked. I prepared the remarks I would be asked to give at the ceremony. I thought, occasionally, about what I was hoping for from the evening. And each time I reached for the hope, I found the same thing waiting. Not proof, not vindication, not the moment when my mother finally understood the full shape of my career. I was hoping to offer her something, one more time, with enough ceremony around it that she might be able to receive it in a way she couldn't receive it from me directly. That is what I was doing when I invited her to the Navy Ball. Offering something. I want to be honest about that, because understanding the hope is necessary for understanding what happened to it. October 19th, 2024. The Navy Ball, Norfolk. We arrived together, Josephine, Daniel, and me, in the same car, through the same hotel entrance. The October evening was cold enough that I had worn a heavy overcoat over my dress whites. The coat covered everything: the collar devices, the decorations, the Distinguished Service Medal already pinned at my throat before I left my room that evening. I had stepped away shortly after we arrived to take a 15-minute secure call in a quiet corridor off the main lobby. Standard procedure for someone in my role at an event of this size. Josephine and Daniel waited near the ballroom entrance with the other arriving guests. When the call ended, I returned to the lobby and walked toward the velvet rope at the ballroom entrance. Captain Henry Hansen, 06, Senior Protocol Officer running door security, 50 years old that year, was doing exactly the job he was stationed to do. He saw a woman in a civilian overcoat approaching the unprocessed side of the entrance without having cleared the check-in point. He moved to intercept. None of that was the problem. The problem was not Henry Hansen. Josephine was 20 feet away when he moved. We had made eye contact as I came across the lobby. She had arrived in the same car as me. She had been standing in that lobby for 15 minutes with my name on her guest pass. She knew exactly who was walking toward that door. She was smiling, not a confused smile, not the reflexive social smile she deployed when something was moderately amusing. The specific smile I had watched her direct at George after a courtroom result, at Camille after a career milestone. The smile she reserved for other people's small corrections. The smile of someone who finds a certain satisfaction in being present when someone else is made temporarily smaller. ID, now. Hansen stepped in front of me. I stopped. I did not reach for anything. I did not explain myself. He read my stillness as defiance and closed his hand around my arm. He was not gentle about it. I held his gaze. In my peripheral vision, 20 feet away, my mother was smiling. Then the earpiece crackled. The lobby had quieted enough that the voice carried across the corridor. Captain Hansen, this is Admiral Reed. Release Rear Admiral Williams. Immediately. Hansen's hand dropped as though contact with my arm had become something dangerous. He stepped back and came to attention and saluted. It was a clean, involuntary salute, the kind the body produces when rank and command arrive at that particular velocity. I removed my overcoat. The Distinguished Service Medal was at my throat. The gold of my collar devices caught the lobby light. Every officer in the lobby came to attention, not on command, but the way trained people respond when something they understand registers in front of them at the correct frequency. In the silence that followed, no one in that room was looking at Josephine. I had tried to tell her, in different words, at different tables, across 23 years of dinners and phone calls, and the cards she sent, and the parties I attended, and the commendations I mentioned that she redirected around. She hadn't believed me. She believed the Navy in 4 seconds flat. The ceremony inside was what such ceremonies are. Formal, precise, the citation read aloud in a room of 400 people. Reed's voice carried the specific, declassified framing and implied the full weight of what the classification kept it from naming. The officers who knew what the citation represented stood very still in the particular way that has a meaning outside of language. At the guest table, Josephine heard her daughter's 23-year career described by a rear admiral to a room full of people who understood its weight without being told. It was the first time anyone with institutional authority over me had explained, in a public room, what the last 23 years had actually been for. I worked the room after the ceremony. I did not go to her. That was a considered choice, not an oversight. Josephine found me in the corridor near the end of the evening. She was composed in the way she always was, but something behind the composure had been reorganized. She said she hadn't known it was like this. She meant the room, the salutes, the medal, the deference and the weight of the ceremony. She did not mean the 23 years. I recognized that distinction immediately and filed it where I kept the things that required more processing than a single night could provide. I thanked her for coming, and I meant it. That was the last conversation we had that evening. Standing alone in the corridor afterward, the ballroom noise, a low current behind me, and the metal at my throat, I held myself very still, not braced, not managing anything visible, just accounting for what had happened, quietly, in the specific way of someone who has built a long record of doing exactly that. The medal was mine. The room had made it visible to the one person who had never looked directly at it. I drove back to Arlington 2 days after the ball. I was not unraveling. I want to be precise about that because the story of a woman who falls apart after a public acknowledgement shadowed by a private betrayal is available, and I am not living it. What I was doing in those days and the weeks that followed was accounting. There's a difference between falling apart and taking stock, and it matters to get that right. What I kept returning to was not Hanson's hand on my arm. That was a protocol error made by a man doing his job without complete information, corrected inside 30 seconds by a superior officer who had been watching from the head table. That is the system functioning as designed. I have spent 23 years inside that system and understand exactly how it works. What I kept returning to was my mother's face before any of it. Elena Reyes found me the following week in the Pentagon corridor between morning briefings. Elena, a captain, 06, 44 years old, and the closest colleague I have had in this career, had attended the ball and had been positioned across the lobby during the entrance incident. She had seen the full sequence. She brought it up without framing it carefully, which is one of the things I have valued about her across 16 years of friendship and working proximity. She said, "She smiled, Olivia. I saw it. She smiled before he touched you." I had been arguing with my own memory about whether that was precisely true, whether I had read the expression correctly in the moment, whether the lobby lighting or the adrenaline had shifted what I saw. Elena saying it out loud meant I could stop the argument with myself. I stopped walking in the corridor. Not dramatically. I stopped and Elena waited. She is good at waiting. After a moment, I said that I had seen it too and that I was glad she had confirmed it. Elena has known me since a joint intelligence posting in 2008. She knows how I process things, slowly, precisely, without needing anyone to manage it for me. She did not offer comfort. She did not tell me what to do with what I had named. She simply confirmed the thing I had seen and then let me have it in whatever form I needed to have it. That is, I have come to understand exactly what a good colleague and a good friend does when someone is working through something real. They don't make it smaller. They don't make it larger. They confirm the outline and step back. We walked the rest of the corridor to my office without speaking further. The useful work had been done. Elena had named the thing I was circling, and that was enough. In November, I opened a file I keep at my apartment. Not classified, personal, promotion letters going back to 2001, commendation citations, orders, service records laid across the kitchen table at 10 o'clock on a weeknight, alone, with nothing performed about the moment. What 23 years of decisions made without anyone's endorsement had produced was spread across that table. The record existed independent of whether anyone who should have been paying attention was paying attention. I looked at the arc of it. Ensign to Rear Admiral, each promotion letter signed by people who had seen the work and evaluated it on its actual terms, each citation describing a version of me that my family had never been given the language to access. 23 years of work that had happened inside a classification system they couldn't penetrate, and a professional culture they didn't have the context to interpret. I had always understood why they couldn't see it. What the ball had clarified was something different. Not their inability to see, but Josephine's decision, at a moment when she could have chosen otherwise, to smile. I was not angry. I was finished being surprised. There is a meaningful difference between those two states, and it took 23 years to know clearly which one I was dealing with. Josephine called in late November. The call was 12 minutes. She said it was a lovely evening. She remarked that she hadn't realized the Navy did things so formally. She mentioned the centerpieces. She asked about Thanksgiving plans. She did not mention the entrance. She did not mention the hand on my arm, or the smile that preceded it, or any part of what happened at that door. I answered everything in the register I'd spent decades perfecting, nothing beyond the surface. When the call ended, I held the phone. I had been waiting for her to say something about the entrance. I had been telling myself that when she acknowledged it, I would know what to do next. What I understood in the moment the screen went dark was that I had been waiting in the wrong direction. The acknowledgement was not coming through her. The 12-minute call had told me exactly what the ball had told me in a quieter register. She had organized her version of events into something she could manage, and what happened at the door did not fit inside that version, and so it had been edited out. Not forgotten, edited. Those are not the same thing, and I had grown old enough and clear-eyed enough to know the difference. Whatever came next was going to have to come through me. In December, working late on the last evening before the holiday recess, I thought about the pattern, the full shape of it, now that I could see the complete outline. 23 years of a relationship in which I provided and absorbed and adjusted and appeared, and in which the other person received all of it without account. The ball had not changed the pattern. It had lit the outline in a room full of witnesses so that I could no longer negotiate with whether I was seeing it accurately. I was not bitter, I was oriented. The Distinguished Service Medal was in its case on the shelf behind my desk, catching the lamplight at the room's edge. I looked at it from my desk chair, then I turned off the lamp and sat in the quiet with what I knew. The pattern was visible in its entirety. The ball had not introduced a new element. It had illuminated the existing one, the same smile, the same redirect, the same arrangement in which what I did and who I had become were absorbed into a narrative she controlled and dispensed on her own terms. What was different now was that I had seen it in a public room, with witnesses, and I could no longer argue with my own perception. The decision formed, not impulsively, but with the particular quiet weight of something that has been building for 23 years and has finally arrived at the moment it was always heading toward. Some recognitions cannot be given back retroactively. That had become true for me over the course of an evening in Norfolk. But the decision about what came next was mine to make, on my own terms, in my own time. I had always operated that way. This was not different. This was simply the most important application of a principle I had lived by for as long as I could remember. January 6th, 2025. I called my mother. I want to be clear about what kind of call it was, because the word confrontation gets applied to conversations like this one, and it isn't accurate. Confrontation requires heat. What I had instead was 2 decades of accumulated clarity and the specific, settled certainty that nothing between us would shift on its own, because it never had. I told her I would not be available for interactions structured the way they had been. I was not ending contact. I was defining terms, the terms under which I was willing to be present, because the previous terms had been defined by what she could absorb and what I was willing to keep absorbing on her behalf, and that arrangement was finished. I named the smile at the ballroom entrance directly. I told her I had seen it and had not forgotten it, and that I was not going to behave as though I had. She ran through the sequence I had been watching my whole life, deployed now in real time. In order, denial first, then minimization, then the reversal that positioned her as the aggrieved party, then the accusation that I always did this when things went well for me, that I manufactured grievances and made my successes about her failures. She ran through all of it in order, as though each deflection had always been preloaded and was simply waiting for the correct trigger. I let her finish. I had expected every element of it. When she was done, I said what I had called to say. I told her I wasn't ending anything, that I was being honest about what I was willing to sustain going forward, that this was not a thing I could reduce to just anything. I meant every word. I got off the phone. George called on January 12th. He was measured and lawyerly. George is always measured and lawyerly, especially when he is managing something on Josephine's behalf. He framed her as fragile, aging, and unintentionally hurtful, rather than deliberately so. He invoked Harold's death, her age, the long family history of getting through difficult things together. He asked me to weigh what reconciliation would cost me against what sustained distance would cost everyone. It was a well-constructed argument, built on facts that were accurate. I listened without interrupting. When he was done, I thanked him for calling and told him I was not revisiting the decision. There was nothing further to explain. He said she wasn't going to be here forever. I said I knew that I had always known it, that it wasn't what this was about. He wasn't wrong about the facts, he was wrong about what the facts obligated me to do. The argument he was making, that the finite nature of a life creates an obligation to absorb harm from the person living it, is a version of an argument I had been accepting, in some form, my whole life. The assumption beneath it is that proximity and biology create a kind of open credit account, and that the account requires payment regardless of what has been deposited into it. I had been making payments against that account for 23 years. The account never balanced. That is not how functional relationships work, and I was finished pretending it was how this one worked. I thanked George again. We ended the call with the surface correctness the Williams family has always been good at, and I did not move from the position I had taken. Daniel texted on January 15th. It was short. He said he didn't know exactly what had happened at the door because he'd been turned away at the moment, but he had seen something on Josephine's face when it was over, and it had bothered him. He wasn't calling to change my mind. He was checking that I was okay. I read the text twice. I wrote back that I was okay. I meant it entirely. He was the only one who asked about me. George and Camille asked about the situation, the family arrangement, the peace, the collective difficulty of living inside the aftermath. Daniel asked about me. That is not a small difference. I have thought about it often since that week in January. Camille called in February. She was Josephine's second deployed resource, after George had exhausted the legal argument channel, and she brought a different approach. Less structured, more direct, more emotional. She said Josephine was struggling. She said the family didn't know how to act. She said the silence was harder than whatever had started it. I was cordial and brief. When she started to say, "You can't just," I interrupted her gently. I told her I wasn't just doing anything. I was making a considered decision about what I was willing to sustain going forward, and that was not something I could reduce to the word just. The word just is how families soften the request they are making of you. It makes the thing they're asking smaller than it is. Just reach out, just let it go. Just remember she loves you in her way. I had been doing things just my whole life. Just adjusting, just absorbing, just letting it go for the sake of the room's temperature. I was finished with that word. Camille went quiet when I said that. Not the kind of quiet that precedes more argument, the kind that precedes recalibration. She said she understood, even if she didn't fully agree, and that she hoped I'd stay in touch. I told her I would. I meant it. Camille and I had never had the relationship that George and Josephine had. She'd been absorbed into the family later, and the dynamics between us had always been more neutral. I was not closing a door with Camille. I was simply not walking through the door she had been sent to hold open. After the Camille call, I sat at my desk without reaching for anything. The phone face down on the surface, the DSM case on the shelf catching the light at the far edge of my vision. My posture upright, not from performance, but from how I am built when something matters and I am holding to it. The family campaign had come in its full sequence, Josephine, then George, then Camille, and it had not moved me because I was not operating from emotion. I was operating from decision. Those are different engines entirely, and they do not respond to the same kind of pressure. The relationship had a new shape, and the new shape was mine to define. For the first time in 45 years, that was true. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the point of everything that had led to it. I want to say one more thing about that period, because it is easy to describe a decision of this kind as something that costs nothing, as though the person making it is simply relieved, simply lighter, simply done. It is not like that. There is grief in redefining a relationship with a parent, even one that has cost you as much as this one had cost me. The grief is not for what the relationship was, it is for what it was never going to become. I grieved that. I did it privately, without ceremony, in the same way I had done most of the difficult things in my life. And then I moved forward, because that is the only direction available when you have made a real decision. By March of 2025, I had turned 46, and the arrangement was functioning on its new terms. Functioning is the correct word, not warmly, not with the ease of a restored relationship, but as honest contact at limited frequency. That was what I had defined and what I was holding. Josephine, according to Daniel, had begun managing the story of the Navy ball in her social circle in Norfolk. She talked about the medal and the ceremony and the grandeur of the ballroom. The version she preferred worked best when no one who had been present was in the audience. Daniel had been there. He didn't confront her version directly. That's not how Daniel operates, but when asked, he offered corrections, accurately and without drama. Her preferred narrative did not hold cleanly when he was in the room. It was a small fracture in the social authority she had always managed carefully. I let it sit where it was. I was done correcting records in rooms I wasn't in. I was also done, I realized around that time, with the particular vigilance of waiting for her narrative to reach me. There had been years when I monitored the edges of family gossip, not obsessively, but with the low-grade awareness of someone who knows that what is said about her in rooms she doesn't enter will eventually affect the rooms she does. I had stopped monitoring. What Josephine told her friends was between Josephine and her friends. My version was my life, and it was visible to anyone who looked at the record directly. At the Pentagon, something I had not planned for was happening. My deputy, Commander Hendricks, mentioned it in a routine debrief sometime in the spring, not as a personal observation, but in the offhand way you mention something obvious. He said I seemed less elsewhere. He was precise without knowing he was being precise. The background processing I had been running for years was no longer running. The management of Josephine's disapproval, the silent argument I carried into every working room about whether I had earned the life I had built. The bandwidth had gone back into the work, and the work was showing it. Reed pulled me aside after a briefing in late spring. He made a specific comment about the quality of my analysis in the past quarter, named the offices that had noticed, and then mentioned that the annual review cycle for '08 consideration was opening. He said, "I don't know what you've changed this year, but keep it. The '08 review is opening. I want your name in it." I told him I appreciated the confidence. What I was actually thinking about in that corridor was not the '08 review. I was thinking about what it meant that the removal of a particular emotional tax, one I had been paying for so long I had stopped noticing it as a separate expense, had produced a measurable change in my professional output. The bandwidth freed up by no longer managing the gap between who I was and what my mother would acknowledge had gone directly back into the work. That was not a poetic observation. It was a professional fact, and Reed had identified it through my output before I had named it to myself in those terms. The connection between the personal decision and the professional change was real. I did not mention it to Reed. Some things do not translate into briefing language. But I knew. In September, George called. Josephine had had a cardiac episode, not life-threatening, but requiring hospitalization for 2 days. Monitoring, medication adjustment, structured discharge planning. He relayed the information clearly, and I appreciated the clarity. I called the hospital directly, spoke with the attending cardiologist, confirmed the situation was stable, the care appropriate, the discharge plan sound, and ensured the follow-up logistics were arranged before the call ended. I did not fly home. I did not make the gesture that everyone watching would have read as the restoration of the old arrangement, because I was not restoring it. I was responding as a responsible family member to a medical situation, precisely to the degree that was appropriate, and no further. Not less than that. Exactly that. George called after the discharge to let me know she was home and resting and that the follow-up cardiology appointment was scheduled. He relayed the information without any secondary agenda attached to it, which I noted and appreciated. The cardiac episode had not changed my position, and I think George had begun to understand by then that calling with a secondary agenda would not change it either. I was her daughter. I was not her emotional support system anymore. Both of those things were simultaneously true, and they did not contradict each other. That was new for me, holding both without one canceling the other, and in the weeks after the episode, I confirmed that I could hold both, that the steadiness was real and not performance. A year to the month after the Navy ball, I had dinner at Elena's apartment in Arlington. She asked somewhere in the middle of the evening whether I was at peace with the way things stood. I thought about the word peace for a moment before answering. Peace implies resolution, a completed accounting, every element settled into final position. That wasn't quite the shape of what I had. I told her I wasn't at peace with having needed to do it. I was at peace with having done it. That distinction matters, and I meant it with precision. The need to restructure a relationship that had run on my provision and her receipt for 23 years is something to grieve quietly and honestly, then move forward from. It is not something to make peace with. But having done it, having held the line through every call and every proxy, through the cardiac episode and the silence, I was at peace with that entirely. Elena raised her glass. We did not need more words than that. It was the first genuinely easy evening I could account for in a very long time. Not performed ease, not the managed comfort of someone running a background monitor. Actual ease, the kind that requires you to monitor nothing and edit yourself for no one, and carry only what is actually yours. I thought about that on the drive home. How long it had been since ease had felt like something I could just inhabit, rather than something I was constructing against a current. The current had been real. I had not imagined it. What was new was not that the current was gone, but that I had stopped swimming against it. I had simply stepped out of the river entirely and discovered that the bank was solid and the ground held my weight, and I did not have to keep moving to stay upright. I drove home with the windows down, despite the October chill, because the air was clean and I was not in a hurry for the first time in longer than I could easily remember. In October of 2025, an envelope arrived at my apartment with Josephine's return address in the upper left corner. Josephine does not write letters. I want to be clear about what that means as a fact. She communicates by phone, by card, at expected occasions, and by proxy through George when something requires more than she is willing to say directly. A handwritten letter was not in her operating vocabulary, and the presence of the envelope told me that before I had read a single word inside it. I stood at the kitchen counter and opened it. It was not long. Even in this unfamiliar form, Josephine was economical. The letter did not say, "I am sorry." It did not have that architecture, those specific words in that sequence. It said she had been thinking about the evening at the ball and about the years before it. She said she didn't expect anything in response. She wanted me to know. I read it twice. It was not an apology. I want to be accurate about that because accuracy is what the story requires, and I'm not willing to soften what was actually offered in order to make the ending more satisfying than it was. But it was the first time she had written to me about the room we were actually in, not the room she preferred to be in, not the version of events she narrated to her social circle in Norfolk. The actual room with its actual furniture and its actual history. That was not nothing. I had spent 23 years wishing she would address the actual room. This was partial and incomplete and was still clearly the first motion she had made toward the door. I folded the letter and placed it on the kitchen counter and stood in the quiet of my apartment for a while without reaching for anything. I did not know what the letter meant in terms of what came next. I did know what it was. A beginning, offered without demand or expectation, which is the only way a beginning of this kind can be offered. The fact that she had not demanded a response, that she had closed the letter without asking for anything, told me something about how much she had understood about what the new terms required of her. I did not call immediately. I lived with the letter for several weeks. In November, I called her. I expected the careful, early minutes that always govern first contact after tension, both of us moving slowly, neither wanting to tip the conversation into territory that closed it down. That happened. And then something else happened. We talked for 35 minutes, not about the ball, not about January 6th. We talked about Harold. There was a specific Sunday afternoon from my childhood, a drive he had taken us on one summer to a stretch of coastline we didn't visit often, that I had almost entirely forgotten and that she remembered differently from the version I had carried. We compared our two recollections without either of us working to win the comparison. We were simply two people remembering the same afternoon from positions 20 feet apart and letting both memories exist without correction. She said at some point in the call, "You were always the stubborn one." I said, "I know, I got that from you." She laughed, the real laugh, not the social one she produced for rooms, not the managed laugh she deployed when something was mildly amusing and she wanted to seem engaged. The actual laugh. I had not heard it in years. I let it sit in the call without making it mean more than it was. It was a laugh. A real one. That was what it was. Thanksgiving was at George's house, which I had named as a condition when George and I spoke in October about whether I was coming. Neutral ground, not Josephine's house, where the furniture and the layout and the family photographs have always organized the room around her authority. I also set the register before I arrived. This was a dinner, not a reckoning. I was not there to relitigate anything, and I would not absorb anyone's discomfort about the past year on their behalf. The dinner was careful. George and Camille were visibly uncertain of the new register. They kept looking toward me to calibrate, which was a dynamic I had not experienced before, and which I noted without comment. Josephine was more measured than usual. Not warmer exactly, more present. The version of her at that table was not performing warmth for the room. She was simply there, eating, contributing occasionally, not managing the evening's emotional arc. Daniel was glad in his uncomplicated way. He sat next to me. We talked about his work and my schedule and a film he'd seen that he thought I'd hate, but should watch anyway. It was ordinary. That is exactly the right word. There was a moment at the table when Josephine handed me the breadbasket. Just that. No commentary, no gesture toward it beyond the passing itself. It was a small thing, but it was an offering, not a performance, and there was no audience she was playing it to. She handed me the bread because I was beside her and the basket was closest to her hand. I took it. We did not have a moment of profound connection that evening. I want to be accurate about that. The dinner did not resolve anything or restore anything or prove that the past year had produced the outcome I might have hoped for if I had been hoping for outcomes. What it produced was something more modest, and I think more real. 2 hours at a table where everyone present was being who they actually were, rather than who the table had always asked them to perform. That is what I had said I wanted when I set the terms for the evening. And that is what the evening delivered. Modest and real is a better outcome than warm and false. I have learned that. It took a long time to learn it. I drove to the airport the next morning through the early light of the Norfolk waterfront. I thought not about the dinner as a benchmark against what it used to be. Those dinners had not been good for a long time, and I had spent years dreading them from September onward. I thought about it against what I had always performed inside them. Last night I had gone as myself. I had sat as myself. I had left intact. The waterfront was quiet at that hour, the harbor gray and still, the base visible through the morning haze the way it had always been visible from the routes I took as a child in Josephine's car. I had grown up in this city and left it and come back to it across 23 years in a capacity that neither of us had been able to predict in 1997. I had stood at the Academy gates in Annapolis and stood at the Pentagon and stood at a ballroom entrance in a Norfolk hotel while a room of officers came to attention. And now I was driving past the harbor at 6:40 in the morning on the day after Thanksgiving, carrying nothing into the airport that I hadn't come in with. I used to begin dreading those dinners in September. This time I had dreaded it for approximately 2 days. That is quiet progress, but it's mine. At the departure gate, I opened a book and read until they called the boarding group. I was not monitoring my phone. I was not managing anything or bracing for anything. I was just reading in a Norfolk airport on the morning after a Thanksgiving dinner that had been careful and imperfect and honest. For the first time in this story, that was enough. By early 2026, I had stopped bracing. That sounds like a modest statement. It is not modest. If you have spent decades in a posture of readiness, perpetually braced against the next dismissal, the next redirect, the next silence where acknowledgement was owed, the moment that posture releases is not small. It is structural. The load shifts. The whole building recalibrates around what has changed. January and February of 2026 were unremarkable on their surface. The Pentagon ran. My team produced the kind of work that accumulates into a record over time. Briefings, reports, the operational machinery of the deputy director role, the particular quality of sustained attention that intelligence administration requires on a daily basis. None of that had changed in substance. What had changed was the quality of presence I brought to it. Reed met with me formally in February about the '08 review. He was specific in the way he is when something is real rather than exploratory. He said my record was strong, leadership assessments consistently high across the review period, analytical output at a level that had drawn notice from offices above his own. No decision had been made, but the door was open, and both of us understood what that meant in context. He said, "I want you to think about the next level. We both know you're ready." I told him I appreciated the confidence. I meant it. What I was actually thinking about standing in that office was the woman who stood outside the Academy gates in Annapolis in May of 2001 with a folded letter in her pocket and the ensign bars catching the morning light. What the next level would mean to her, not as proof of anything, not as vindication for all the years it wasn't acknowledged, but as the next true thing in a sequence of true things she had built, one decision at a time, without asking anyone's permission. Reed didn't need any of that from me. I thanked him and returned to my office. In late February, I picked up the Distinguished Service Medal case from the shelf at my apartment. I had not opened it since I placed it there in October of 2024, and I sat with it at the kitchen table and looked at the latch for a moment, and then I opened it. The medal was there. It had always been there. What I looked for in it that evening was not the reflection of the ball or the salutes or the corridor or my mother's face in any register. I looked at the thing itself, the citation it represented, the work it acknowledged, and the work it couldn't acknowledge by name. 23 years of decisions made in rooms I couldn't describe to the people who should have been paying attention. The thing about recognition is that it doesn't retroactively change the years it wasn't there. It just sits next to them. You decide what to do with that arrangement. I was deciding. And what I was finding in the quiet of that evening was that I could hold the medal and the years, and the absence all in the same frame without any of them canceling the others. The record was real. The absence had been real. Both were true. Both could exist, without one negating the other. That was not a resolution exactly. It was something more like an acceptance, not of what had happened as right, but of it as finished, as the past-shaped thing it had already become. I was not carrying it forward as a wound. I was carrying it forward as history. That is a different weight entirely. I closed the case and put the kettle on. Daniel called in February on his regular rhythm of contact. He mentioned, without prompting, that Josephine had been talking about me differently since Thanksgiving. He couldn't fully characterize the shift. She wasn't transformed. He made clear he wasn't telling me that, because Daniel doesn't tell me things that aren't true. But in December, she had asked him what my actual job title was. The full title: Deputy Director of Naval Operations Intelligence. For the first time in the entirety of my career holding this role or its predecessors, she had asked. She asked me what your job title was. Actual title. First time she's ever asked. That was new. I received it carefully. I did not build a story around it or construct an expectation on its foundation. I held it with the same care I had learned to apply to small, real things, neither dismissing it nor inflating it into something it had not yet proven itself to be. Something was shifting in her, slowly, without fanfare, at a distance I was not responsible for managing. That was all I needed to know about it for now. The shift was hers to make. My responsibility was only to remain exactly where I had said I would be, present, on honest terms, at a frequency that didn't cost me more than I had decided to spend. I thanked Daniel for telling me. He said of course, and we talked for another 20 minutes about things that had nothing to do with Josephine, which is also what a steady relationship looks like. In early March, I walked my regular morning route along the Riverside Path in Arlington. The city was quiet at that hour. The water was flat and gray with early spring light. I was not thinking about my mother specifically. I was thinking about the larger shape of what the past 16 months had produced, not in terms of the relationship, which was finding its own level on its own time, but in terms of the resource itself. I had spent 23 years redirecting myself toward the work, toward the right result. Away from the approval I was not going to receive, back toward the thing I could actually build and keep. That redirection had produced everything I had. It had also carried a cost. The energy of constant reorientation is not free, and you pay for it out of something real. I had paid for it out of a portion of my attention and my peace, and the particular kind of ease that a person feels when they are not perpetually managing the distance between who they are and who someone needs them to be. I was 10 days from my 47th birthday, walking in the early morning cold of the Virginia Riverside, and the question forming in my mind was not, how do I survive this, or how do I perform well despite this? The question was simpler and, because of that, larger than anything I had asked in years. What do you do with the energy when it comes home? I did not have an answer yet, but I knew I was finally asking the right question. That is its own kind of progress, the kind that lives in what you are finally able to ask, rather than what you have already answered. For 23 years, the question had been, how do I keep going? The answer to that question had been my career, my record, my work. Now a different question was available, and I was standing on the riverbank in the early morning asking it out loud to no one in particular, which is where all the important questions eventually arrive. I stood at the railing over the water and let it exist without forcing it toward resolution. Then I turned and walked back along the path. The day formed around me, early and unhurried. I walked into it. March 15th, 2026. I turned 47. I woke in my apartment in Arlington at 6:15 without an alarm, which is how I have woken most mornings for 23 years. The military habit of early rising embedded too deeply now to negotiate with, outlasting every reassignment and every change of address. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window with the mug and looked at the morning light moving across the rooflines of the neighborhood, the particular low gold of a mid-March morning in Virginia, when the season is deciding whether it is finally ready to commit to spring. Nothing was required of me before 0700. That was the fact of the morning, and it was a good fact. My phone held a voice memo from Daniel, sent at 11:47 the previous night. Daniel keeps hours that do not correspond to any professional calendar I'm familiar with. And he had recorded 40 seconds of himself singing the birthday song, fully off key, fully committed, with a spoken aside in the middle of the second verse about having attempted the high note twice before deciding to leave the failure in the recording rather than start over. I listened to it twice. I laughed both times. The real laugh, unguarded, with nothing managed about it. Elena's text had arrived at 6:03 that same morning, confirming a dinner reservation for Saturday and adding, "No uniform required." I wrote back a single word, perfect, and meant it precisely. I had been 47 for less than an hour, and the people I most wanted to hear from had already been in touch, and the morning was mine without agenda. That is a life, not a small one, the right one. The week at the Pentagon was unremarkable by surface measure and privately significant by every other. Briefings, reports, the daily machinery of a role I have inhabited for 4 years and understand at every level. I ran the morning staff meeting the way I run it. Direct, paced, with the expectation that everyone in the room has read the relevant material and is prepared to work. My team met that expectation. They usually do. I have assembled people who understand the difference between going through the motions and doing the actual work. Hendricks caught me in the corridor after the midweek briefing and said the analysis package we'd submitted in February had drawn specific commendation from an office 2 levels above Reed's. He delivered this in the offhand register he uses when something is obvious to him, which is precisely how I know when something has actually landed at the level it was designed to reach. I told him to pass the commendation along to the team. It was their work as much as mine, and they should hear it. Reed passed me in the corridor on Thursday. He gave a nod, not a greeting nod, but a specific one, carrying information about a process moving in the direction it was supposed to be moving. I returned it the same way. We have worked together long enough to communicate in that economy of expression without either of us needing to narrate it. I used to carry a version of my mother into every room I worked in. Her voice, her disapproval. The question she had never stopped asking me, in some form, since 1997. Whether the life I had chosen was the right one. Whether what I'd built without her permission was worth what it had cost the family's picture of itself. I carried that question into briefings and assessments and decision rooms for 2 decades, running it beneath the surface of everything else I managed. I don't carry it anymore. You would be surprised how much space that frees up inside a working day. Or perhaps if you have carried something similar for a long time, you wouldn't be surprised at all. Josephine called on the morning of my birthday at 8:40 while I was at my desk reviewing the first briefing materials of the day. The call was 4 minutes. She said happy birthday and asked whether I was well. I told her yes, that I was. She said she was glad. She did not ask about work, did not mention George or Camille in any comparative framing, did not have an agenda waiting beneath the surface of the question she had called to ask. I just wanted to say happy birthday, that's all. That's all. 2 words that took 47 years to arrive without something attached to them, without a correction embedded in the congratulation, or a redirect waiting at the edge of the sentiment. I took them at face value. I let them be exactly what they were. For the first time, that was enough. The Saturday dinner with Elena was at a restaurant in Arlington we had been to before. Comfortable and unhurried, the kind of place that works for long conversations without the service managing the pace of the evening on your behalf. We talked about her upcoming posting, which we had known was coming for a year and had been holding at careful distance until the orders were in hand. We talked about the '08 review in concrete, professional terms, neither inflated nor dismissed. We talked about the past year and a half in the broad strokes of 2 people who have been paying close attention to the same sequence from their respective positions and are now ready to say what they saw. And then I said the thing I had not been able to say before in quite this form. Not, I'm fine, because that had always been available and had never been entirely true in the way it presents itself. Not, I'm at peace with it, which I had said to Elena before, and which was accurate, but incomplete. What I said was simpler than either of those. And because it was simpler, it was more true. I said I was genuinely okay. Not performing okay, not managing okay, actually specifically, without qualification or caveat. Okay. Elena looked at me for a moment, the particular look of someone confirming that the thing they're hearing is the thing they think they're hearing. Then she raised her glass. To 47. I raised mine. To knowing what's yours and keeping it. I drove home from the dinner with the window down, the late March air carrying the last edge of winter, but moving unmistakably towards something warmer and more certain. I was not in a hurry. I had nothing to monitor. I came home and hung my jacket in the hall. The apartment was quiet in the way apartments are quiet late on Saturday evenings, not empty, but inhabited. The quiet of a space that belongs to someone and knows it. The Distinguished Service Medal was in its case on the shelf, the lamplight catching the case's edge at the angle it always catches at that hour. I did not open it. I did not need to open it. It was there, and I knew what it was, and that was enough. I sat in the armchair by the window. The city made its low sound outside. The room was still. I was still in the same way, not braced, not monitoring anything, not performing any version of composure for any audience. Present in a life I had built, one decision at a time, without asking anyone's permission, and kept. If you have been the person who always shows up for someone who could never quite show up for you, I want you to know something. The energy doesn't disappear when you stop spending it on the wrong places. It comes home. And when it does, so do you. I didn't just walk away from something that wasn't working. I walked toward myself. And it turns out that's a direction you can keep going. That was my story, and what I learned is simple. Sometimes peace begins the moment you stop begging to be understood. Have you ever had to choose yourself after years of being overlooked? Did protecting your peace feel easy, or did it come with grief too? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story spoke to you, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about self-respect, boundaries, and finding your way back to yourself.